I didn't wake up planning to betray anyone. I wasn't bored, lonely, or looking for attention. Nothing physical ever happened. No touches, no kisses, no secrets that could be proven. But there was a moment I remember too clearly. A moment that still makes my chest tighten. That's when I knew something inside me had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough that I was no longer innocent. I'm a woman in a long-term relationship that looks solid from the outside. We share a home, routines, plans, and a future people assume is safe. I wasn't searching for excitement or an escape. I wasn't trying to cross any lines or hurt anyone I love. What happened didn't start as a problem. It started as something small, ordinary, and easy to justify, and that's what scares me the most. How normal it felt at first. Before I continue, I want to know what you think. Have you ever crossed a line without realizing it at the time? If this kind of story makes you reflect, leave a comment, subscribe, and share. These conversations matter. It didn't start with flirting. That's important to say, because I've replayed the beginning so many times trying to locate the exact mistake. There was no intention behind it, no plan, no hunger for something else. It was just a moment that felt ordinary. I met him through a situation I couldn't avoid. Work-related, routine, the kind of interaction you don't think twice about because it fits neatly into your day. We talk the way adults talk when they're being polite and efficient. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. The first thing that stood out wasn't attraction. It was ease. The conversation flowed without effort. No pauses, no performance. I didn't feel like I had to explain myself or edit my thoughts. I remember thinking, this is nice. In the same way you think fresh air is nice when you didn't realize you were holding your breath. Nothing about it felt dangerous. I went home that day and didn't mention him because there was nothing to mention. No detail worth sharing. No story. No spark that felt inappropriate. Just a calm, quiet sense of being understood that lingered longer than I expected. But over the next few interactions, something subtle began to shift. I started noticing when we would cross paths. Not in an obsessive way, more like awareness. I caught myself preparing responses in my head before he even spoke. I told myself that was normal. That's just how conversations work when people communicate well. The problem wasn't what we talked about. It was how present I felt while talking to him. I didn't compare him to my partner. I didn't fantasize. I didn't imagine alternatives. What I did was something harder to admit. I enjoyed being seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. And once I noticed that feeling, I couldn't unnotice it. Still, I told myself I was being ridiculous. People connect. That's life. That doesn't mean anything. I was committed, loyal, grounded. This was just my brain overanalyzing something harmless. But that night, lying next to my partner, I caught myself thinking about a sentence he had said earlier in the day. Not the words themselves. The way he'd said my name. Casually, naturally, as if it belonged in his mouth. That was the first time I felt uneasy with myself, because nothing had happened. And yet, something had already begun. Was I wrong for enjoying that feeling instead of shutting it down immediately? After that first moment of unease, I expected the feeling to fade. That's usually how these things go, right? You notice something, feel a little weird about it, and then life moves on. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just one of those passing human moments that don't deserve attention. But it didn't fade. It settled. The next time we talked, I was aware of myself in a way I hadn't been before. Not self-conscious, more alert. I noticed my tone, my timing, the way I listened. I hated that I noticed those things, because it meant a part of me was more engaged than it needed to be. Still, I kept everything neutral. I didn't share anything personal. I didn't ask questions that crossed a line. I stayed within the boundaries of what anyone would consider appropriate. If someone had been standing right next to us, there would have been nothing to explain. That's what made it so confusing. On the outside, I was doing everything right. On the inside, I was starting to feel like I was managing something instead of simply living. What changed wasn't my behavior. It was my anticipation. I started wondering if we'd talk again. I noticed small absences when we didn't. And when we did, I felt a quiet relief that annoyed me more than anything else. I didn't tell my partner about these interactions, not because I was hiding them, but because they didn't seem important enough to bring up. At least, that's how I justified it. Why create a story out of nothing? Why turn something harmless into a problem? But there was a moment that stuck with me. He laughed at something I said, genuinely, without restraint. And for a split second, I felt proud, not pleased, proud, like I had given something of myself and it had landed. That reaction scared me. I remember thinking, this shouldn't matter. And right after that, realizing it already did. That night, I almost mentioned him casually to my partner. Almost. The words sat on my tongue, then disappeared. I told myself it wasn't worth cluttering the conversation, but deep down, I knew the real reason. Once I said it out loud, I'd have to decide what it meant, and I wasn't ready to do that. So I stayed quiet, and in that quiet, something fragile started to form. Do you think the line is crossed when you hide something? Or only when you act on it? Silence has a way of teaching you what you're willing to live with. After I chose not to mention him, nothing exploded. My relationship didn't change overnight. My partner was the same, caring, present, unaware. And that almost made it easier to keep going as if everything was normal. But I wasn't the same. I started paying attention to what I didn't say. Not just about him, about myself. I caught moments where I edited stories, trimmed details, chose safer words, not lies, just omissions, small enough to justify, small enough to feel responsible. When I ran into him again, the familiarity felt too quick, not intimate, comfortable. We'd already established a rhythm, and that scared me more than attraction ever could, because comfort sneaks past your defenses without asking permission. He didn't push. That's important. He didn't flirt openly or test boundaries. If anything, he mirrored the tone I set, which meant the responsibility stayed with me. I couldn't blame him for anything I was feeling. At one point, he asked a simple question about my day. Nothing personal, nothing loaded. But I answered honestly, more honestly than I'd realized I'd been with anyone lately. I didn't overshare. I didn't complain. I just spoke freely. And afterward, I felt exposed. I remember walking away and thinking, why did that feel different? Why did it feel lighter? Why did I feel like I'd taken a breath I didn't know I'd been holding? That question followed me longer than it should have. That night, my partner asked how my day was. I gave a version of the truth. Accurate, but incomplete. I skipped the part where I felt seen. I skipped the part where someone else's attention had lingered with me longer than it should have. I told myself I was protecting the relationship, that not every thought needs to be shared, that adults are allowed private inner worlds, and maybe that's true. But I also knew I was protecting myself from having to answer a harder question, because if I said it out loud, I'd have to face why it mattered at all. And that's when I realized the shift wasn't about him. It was about me, and the fact that I was starting to manage two versions of myself depending on who I was talking to. That realization sat heavy in my chest. Was I still being honest? If the truth depended on who was asking, by the time I admitted something was wrong, I had already adjusted to it. That's the part I don't like to confess. How quietly this became part of my routine. Not exciting, not dramatic, just present. Like background noise you stop noticing until the power goes out. I didn't wake up thinking about him, but certain moments of my day felt incomplete when he wasn't part of them. A conversation that didn't happen. A familiar presence that didn't appear. And I hated myself for noticing those gaps, because noticing meant attachment, and attachment meant responsibility. I started questioning my own reactions. Why did a simple interaction linger in my mind longer than it deserved to? Why did I replay neutral conversations as if I were looking for something hidden inside them? There was nothing there. No invitation. No promise. And yet I kept searching. What unsettled me most was how controlled everything still was. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't acting reckless. I wasn't fantasizing or rewriting my life. I was functioning. Loving my partner. Showing up. Making dinner. Talking about plans. From the outside, nothing had changed at all. But inside, I had started negotiating with myself. I told myself that attraction is involuntary, that connection doesn't equal betrayal, that thoughts aren't actions. All of that is true. I still believe that. But I also knew there was a difference between experiencing a thought and feeding it with attention, and I was feeding it. I began to recognize patterns I didn't like, how I felt slightly more energized after seeing him, how my mood dipped when days passed without crossing paths, how I caught myself wondering if he noticed the same things I did, and immediately shut that thought down. That push and pull exhausted me. There was one moment that stands out clearly now. He said something kind. Not personal, not intimate, just kind. And my instinctive response wasn't gratitude. It was restraint. I held myself back from leaning into that warmth. And the effort it took surprised me. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. I was no longer just reacting. I was actively managing a boundary. And once you start managing a boundary, it means the boundary is under pressure. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while my partner slept beside me. I listened to his breathing, steady and familiar, and felt a sharp contrast between that safety and the tension sitting in my chest. I wasn't afraid of losing him. I was afraid of what it said about me that I could feel pulled elsewhere without wanting to go. I didn't want a different life. I didn't want a different partner. I just didn't want to feel this divided inside myself, and that was the hardest part to admit, that nothing external was forcing this. I was choosing, every day, not to step away from a feeling that made me feel more alive than I expected. At this point, do you think awareness makes it better? Or does it make it worse? Once I reached that level of awareness, I assumed I would correct course. That's how I see myself, someone who notices a problem and fixes it. Someone who values stability, honesty, and long-term choices over fleeting feelings. I truly believed that naming what was happening would be enough to stop it. It wasn't. What changed wasn't the situation, but my internal posture toward it. Instead of drifting unknowingly, I became deliberate, careful. I set quiet rules for myself. Don't linger too long. Don't initiate. Don't let conversations drift into anything personal. On paper, it sounded responsible. In reality, it made everything heavier. Every interaction became a calculation. I monitored my tone, my expressions, the length of eye contact. I replayed conversations afterward, checking for mistakes that no one else could see. The effort was subtle, but constant. And that constant effort is what wore me down. The most unsettling part was how reasonable my justifications sounded. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't crossing boundaries. I wasn't betraying anyone. I was simply managing myself, and adults manage themselves all the time. That's maturity. That's restraint. Except it didn't feel like restraint. It felt like suppression. I noticed that I was becoming more guarded at home. Not distant, just less transparent. I shared the events of my day, but not the emotional texture of them. I talked about what happened, not how it landed. And each time I chose that version of the truth, it became easier to repeat. My partner didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't question it. That trust made everything worse, because there was no confrontation to stop me. No mirror held up except my own reflection, and I was learning how to look away from it. There was a moment when I caught myself thinking, I'm handling this well. That thought stopped me cold, because handling something well doesn't usually feel this lonely. It doesn't require this much internal negotiation. It doesn't leave you questioning your own character late at night. I realized then that I had stopped asking myself whether this was right. I was only asking whether it was still safe. Safe enough to continue. Safe enough to stay invisible. Safe enough not to disrupt the life I had built. And that question, how far can this go without consequences, scared me more than desire ever could. Because once you start measuring safety instead of integrity, you're already moving away from who you thought you were. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I wanted anything to happen, but because I knew something already had. Something internal, something quiet, something I hadn't chosen, but also hadn't refused. And I didn't know how to undo that. Do you think self-control still counts if it costs you your sense of honesty? After that night, I made a decision that felt sensible at the time. I told myself I would create distance, not dramatically, not in a way that would raise questions, just enough space to let things settle back into place. Distance always sounds like the responsible answer when you don't want to confront the real issue. At first, it worked. We didn't talk as much. I avoided situations where we'd cross paths unnecessarily. I kept interactions brief, efficient, polite, and for a short while, I felt relief, the kind that comes when tension loosens, even if it doesn't disappear. But what I didn't expect was how loud the absence would feel. Without the distraction, I was left alone with myself, with the thoughts I'd been postponing, with the realization that what unsettled me most wasn't him. It was what that connection had revealed about a gap I hadn't acknowledged before. I started noticing things in my relationship I had learned to ignore. Not problems, exactly. More like silences. Conversations that stayed practical. Affection that was real, but predictable. Love that was steady, but no longer curious. None of it was wrong. But suddenly, it felt unfinished. That scared me more than temptation ever did. I asked myself questions I hadn't dared to before. When was the last time I felt fully seen without having to explain myself? When did I stop sharing the small thoughts, the half-formed ideas, the pieces of me that didn't serve a purpose? And why had I accepted that as normal? I hated that these questions existed at all, because they felt unfair to my partner, someone who hadn't done anything wrong, someone who showed up, who cared, who trusted me without hesitation. The guilt of that trust sat heavy in my chest. Distance didn't erase the pull. It clarified it. I realized that wanting to be understood isn't a betrayal on its own. Wanting connection isn't immoral. But acting as if those wants didn't exist, pretending they couldn't grow into something dangerous, was its own kind of dishonesty. One evening, my partner asked me if something was wrong. Not accusingly, gently, the kind of question that comes from concern, not suspicion. I told him I was just tired, busy, overthinking things, and he believed me. That moment broke something in me, because I saw how easy it was to lie without lying, how little it took to protect a secret no one knew existed, and how quickly I was becoming skilled at it. I wasn't proud of that skill. I was afraid of it. I understood then that distance wasn't a solution. It was avoidance, and avoidance doesn't make things smaller. It gives them time to root themselves deeper, out of sight. That night, I sat alone with the uncomfortable truth that I hadn't created space to protect my relationship. I'd created space to avoid choosing, and not choosing was starting to feel like a choice on its own. Do you think avoiding a decision is still a form of decision? Especially when someone else trusts you completely. Once I accepted that avoidance was no longer neutral, I started feeling the weight of time, not urgency, pressure, the kind that builds quietly when you know something unresolved is stretching on longer than it should. I wasn't panicking, but I was no longer calm either. I was suspended. I began to notice how much energy this internal conflict was taking from me. Simple moments required effort. I was present, but not fully settled, laughing but slightly delayed, listening, but filtering my own thoughts at the same time. It felt like living with one foot on the ground and the other hovering, never quite landing. The next time I saw him after creating distance, the shift was obvious to me. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no emotional scene, just a brief interaction, polite, shorter than before, almost cautious. And instead of relief, I felt a sharp sense of loss. That reaction scared me more than anything else so far, because it meant I hadn't just been responding to attention. I had been responding to possibility. Not a future, not an affair, just the possibility of being seen in a way that felt effortless. And now that door felt partially closed. I told myself that this feeling was temporary, that discomfort is part of doing the right thing, that integrity isn't supposed to feel easy. I repeated those thoughts like rules, hoping they would anchor me back into certainty. But certainty didn't come. What came instead was self-judgment. I started questioning my own character in ways I never had before. Was I weaker than I thought? More selfish? Less loyal? Or was I simply human in a way I'd never had to confront so directly? I hated that I didn't have a clean answer. One night, I stood in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember staring at nothing in particular, realizing how much effort I'd spent protecting an image of myself, not for others, but for me. The image of someone who would never let things get this complicated. I thought about telling my partner everything, not because I wanted absolution, but because honesty felt like the only way to realign myself. But the words wouldn't form. How do you confess something that never technically happened without sounding cruel or unnecessary? How do you say, I didn't cheat, but I almost became someone I don't recognize? I understood then that confession wasn't simple truth-telling. It was impact. It was consequence. And once spoken, there would be no way to take it back. The trust between us would change shape, even if nothing else did. So I stayed silent, not out of malice, out of fear of causing pain for something I was still trying to understand myself. But silence has its own consequences. As days passed, I felt a growing tension between who I was being and who I believed myself to be. The gap wasn't wide yet, but it was widening. Slowly, invisibly, and I could feel myself standing at the edge of it. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was waiting for myself to decide who I was willing to be. And the longer I waited, the harder that decision felt. At this point, would honesty heal more than it hurts? Or would it only shift the damage to someone who didn't deserve it? By then, the tension wasn't something I could push to the background anymore. It had started to color everything, not dramatically, not in obvious ways, but enough that I felt it in my body, a tightness in my chest, a restlessness that followed me even in quiet moments, the kind of discomfort you can't explain without sounding irrational. I noticed how careful I had become with myself, not just with words or actions, but with emotions. I stopped letting myself feel things fully, because every feeling seemed to require evaluation. Is this safe? Is this appropriate? Does this mean something more? Living like that was exhausting. What bothered me most was the absence of a clear fault. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where I went wrong. No message sent too late at night. No secret meeting. No explicit line crossed. Just a slow accumulation of inner choices that never made it to the surface. I began to understand how people end up in situations they swear they never intended. Not because they're reckless, but because they keep postponing honesty. With others, and with themselves. I saw myself doing exactly that, and the recognition was deeply uncomfortable. I started asking harder questions. If nothing had happened, why did I feel the need to defend my behavior in my own head? Why did I rehearse explanations no one had asked for? Why did the idea of transparency feel so threatening if I truly believed I'd done nothing wrong? Those questions didn't accuse me. They cornered me. I also began to notice something else. Resentment. Not toward my partner, not toward him, but toward the situation itself. Toward the fact that I felt forced into this moral puzzle without asking for it. I resented having to choose between peace and honesty, between stability and self-respect. That resentment scared me, because it meant I was no longer just confused. I was uncomfortable with the role I was playing in my own life. Smiling through routines, answering questions, making plans, all while carrying a version of myself that no one else could see. One evening, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't look away. I remember thinking how normal I appeared, how nothing about me suggested conflict or doubt, and yet, internally, I felt split, like I was maintaining two parallel truths that refused to merge. I knew then that this couldn't stay unresolved forever, not because something would inevitably happen, but because I would change if it did, quietly, gradually, in ways that would be harder to reverse later. The realization hit me with an unexpected sense of urgency, not panic, clarity, the kind that tells you the waiting itself is no longer neutral, that standing still has become its own form of movement. I didn't know what the right choice was yet, but I knew I was running out of room to avoid making one. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit something I'd been resisting. This wasn't about temptation anymore. It was about integrity, and whether I was willing to protect it before it eroded completely. If staying silent slowly changes who you are, is that silence still harmless? By the time I reached that point, I could feel the decision pressing in on me. Not like a deadline, but like gravity, the kind that doesn't announce itself, yet becomes impossible to ignore. I knew something had to shift, not externally, but internally, and that knowledge followed me everywhere. I started paying attention to my own reactions more closely. Not to him, not to my partner, but to myself, to the moments when my chest tightened for no obvious reason, to the way I hesitated before answering simple questions, to how often I asked myself, what version of me is showing up right now? That question didn't have a comfortable answer. I realized I was afraid of two very different outcomes. Afraid that if I stayed silent, I would slowly become someone who could live with half-truths. And afraid that if I spoke up, I would cause pain that couldn't be undone. Pain for something that existed mostly inside my own head. Both options felt heavy. One felt dishonest. The other felt cruel. I replayed moments with my partner in my mind. The trust in his voice. The way he assumed my transparency without ever demanding it. The ease with which he believed me when I said I was fine. That trust had weight, and I felt it pressing down on every unspoken thought. What scared me most was the realization that no one was forcing my hand. There was no confrontation, no discovery, no external pressure. Whatever happened next would be a result of my own values, not circumstances, and that meant I couldn't hide behind confusion forever. I asked myself what I would want if the roles were reversed, if my partner carried something like this alone. Not an act, but a shift. Would I want to know? Or would knowing only burden me with doubt I couldn't resolve? I didn't have a clean answer. I noticed that I had started imagining the future in smaller pieces. Not because I didn't believe in it anymore, but because committing fully felt dishonest while this remained unresolved. It was as if my life had paused itself, waiting for me to catch up. One evening, I almost spoke. The words formed clearly in my mind. I even felt my body prepare for them. But at the last moment, I stopped, not out of fear, out of uncertainty about what honesty would actually accomplish. Would it bring clarity, or would it simply transfer my discomfort onto someone who trusted me completely? That hesitation told me something important. I wasn't trying to protect my partner from pain. I was trying to protect myself from responsibility, from owning the fact that innocence isn't lost through action alone. Sometimes it's lost through awareness. I understood then that whatever I chose next would define this story more than anything that had already happened. Because this wasn't about what I had done. It was about what I was willing to live with. And standing on that edge, I finally accepted that not choosing much longer would be its own kind of betrayal, not of my partner, but of myself. If you know a truth will change everything, is choosing silence still the safer option? I didn't make the decision in a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no revelation, no emotional explosion that forced clarity. It happened quietly, the way most real decisions do. When you're tired of carrying something alone and realize that continuing as you are is already changing you. I realized I couldn't keep living in a version of myself that required constant management, not because anyone was watching, but because I was. I was exhausted from monitoring my thoughts, from weighing every feeling, from pretending neutrality where there was none. That kind of internal division doesn't stay contained forever. What finally pushed me wasn't guilt. It was self-respect. I didn't want to become someone who could justify silence indefinitely, someone who chose comfort over coherence, someone who slowly redefined honesty until it no longer asked anything of her. So I made a choice that felt both simple and terrifying. I ended the ambiguity, not with a confession full of unnecessary detail, not with dramatics, but with a clear internal boundary that I could actually live by. I stepped away completely. I didn't leave space for casual encounters. I didn't maintain connections that required explanation. I removed myself from situations that asked me to negotiate my integrity instead of honoring it. No announcement, no closure scene, just distance, real distance, this time. And then I turned back toward my relationship with honesty, not perfection. I didn't unload every thought I'd ever had, because honesty isn't about transferring your inner chaos onto someone else. But I did recommit, consciously, to transparency in the ways that mattered. I stopped editing myself. I stopped hiding my inner world behind convenience. What surprised me most was what followed. The tension eased, not because everything became exciting again overnight, but because I was whole again. I wasn't split between who I appeared to be and who I knew myself to be. That alignment brought a quiet relief I hadn't realized I was missing. I also learned something uncomfortable but important. Innocence isn't about never feeling tempted. It's about what you do once you recognize that temptation exists. I didn't lose my relationship to another person. I almost lost myself to indecision. And that's what stays with me now. The understanding that integrity isn't proven in the moments everyone can see. It's proven in the quiet choices you make when nothing has technically gone wrong yet. That's where character actually lives. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.